Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 23, Charles the Hammer, also known as Charles Martel. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the new Muslim Caliphate had conquered North Africa, which had been controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire. Unlike the empire, which had loosely governed the region, the Muslims continued to expand. An expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar to the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula proved surprisingly successful when the Visigoth king died in battle. The major Visigoth nobles failed to unite behind a successor, so the Muslims were able to conquer most of the peninsula within a few years, replacing the Visigoths as the rulers of Hispania. Meanwhile, Frankia had been reunited after Pippin, the mayor of Austrasia, had won a decisive victory against the Neustrians at Poitiers. Pippin retained control of the kingdom of Frankia for several decades, while a series of weak kings served as figureheads. Given the lack of an adult heir, a smooth succession was unlikely. Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy had been forced together into a single kingdom under Pippin, but that kingdom soon fell apart because, well, a child had been appointed mayor of the palace. It soon became clear that the decision to make a child mayor of the palace and basically ruler of the kingdom had been a dangerous risk. Admittedly, children had often sat on the throne, but they were figureheads anyway. The mayor of the palace was supposed to rule through the king as a figurehead, but now the regent, Pletrude, needed to rule through her grandson, the mayor, who then ruled through the king. Honestly, the question was not whether or not there would be a revolt, but who would revolt first. Since Pippin had been based in Austrasia, the Neustrians unsurprisingly revolted, and a noble named Ragenfred became mayor of Neustria. Still, a king was required for legitimacy, so when Dagobert III died in 715, he was succeeded by Chilperic II, supposedly the son of Childeric II, although he was actually a monk named Daniel. The supporters of Pippin had retained control of Austrasia, but while they were dealing with the Neustrians in the south, Radbod invaded from Frisia in the northwest. Given the marriage alliance arranged by Pippin, it seems strange that Radbod was attacking the lands of his grandson Theodald, but he clearly did not trust Pletrude to preserve Frisia's autonomy. Pletrude and the family's remaining supporters were facing defeat when Pippin's illegitimate son Charles intervened. Having served with his father, he had enough support among the nobles to raise an army. Although the combination of the Frisians and the Neustrians was unstoppable, Charles later encountered the Neustrians on their own and defeated them on March 21, 717. Accepting the limits of his power, he did not invade Neustria, but appointed himself mayor of Austrasia and found a Merovingian to proclaim as King Clothar IV. Charles also confiscated his father's treasury from his stepmother, eliminating her as a rival. It is worth pointing out that Charles was relatively merciful. Although it had occurred a century earlier, Pletrude undoubtedly was well aware of Brunhild's fate, so a comfortable retirement in a nunnery was preferable to being torn apart by horses. In fact, Charles even spared the life of his nephew Theodald. Since the Frisians had been driven out of Frankia, King Chilperic and his loyal mayor Ragenfred needed an ally. Fortunately, Duke Odo wanted to preserve Aquitaine's independence, so he joined the Neustrians in 718, but they were defeated. Ragenfred fled to Angers because it was located on the edge of Brittany, so it was basically independent, while Chilperic and Odo retreated south to Aquitaine. Frankia had been reunited, but Charles wanted to settle the matter and marched south. Outnumbered, Odo handed over Chilperic, which should have resulted in either Chilperic's death or, more likely, exile to a remote monastery. Fortunately for Chilperic, Charles's own puppet king had died recently, so he and Chilperic came to terms. Chilperic remained king, but listened carefully to the advice of his loyal mayor, who happened to be Charles. So, did Charles forgive Odo? Probably not, but his control over Frankia was far from stable, so he acknowledged the independence of Aquitaine. It is worth pointing out that when Clothar I had died in 561, the kingdom was made up of Neustria, Austrasia, Burgundy, and Aquitaine. However, Aquitaine had broken apart from Frankia while the mayors had fought each other. Odo probably realized that Charles would want to force Aquitaine back into Frankia sooner or later. Fortunately for Odo, the death of Radbod in 719 left Frisia vulnerable, so Charles decided to focus the recently reunited Frankish army on the conquest of Frisia. In fact, the unity of Frankia was bad news for its neighbors. Charles understandably wanted to avoid another revolt. Well, one way to unite the lords from Neustria, Burgundy, and Austrasia was to lead them on raids against weaker neighbors. Charles besieged Angers and raided Bavaria. Each time he returned with other people's wealth, which he used to reward Frankish nobles, which in turn ensured the stability of his rule. Wait, Bavaria and the Lombards had worked together before to resist Frankish expansion. Why had the Lombards left Bavaria to face the Franks alone? Well, the Lombards were busy. More accurately, they were failing completely to establish stability or a smooth succession. A never-ending stream of coups, revolts, and civil wars kept the Lombards too busy fighting each other to expand over the Alps. Anyway, any Lombard king who gained full control over the kingdom would usually expand south against the Exarchate of Ravenna, which was composed of Ravenna and Rome, linked by a narrow, heavily defended road against the Apennine Mountains. This fragile entity had managed to survive and became the buffer between the main Lombard kingdom and the Lombard duchies in the south. In 680, the empire accepted the existence of the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy, and the Lombards stopped their aggressive expansion into the regions of Italy controlled by Constantinople. The peace established in 680, or rather the lack of war, lasted nearly 40 years until Liutprand became king of the Lombards. Marriage to the Duke of Bavaria protected his northern border. By 717, Liutprand felt sufficiently secure that he could take advantage of the declining power of Constantinople in Italy. Aware that the Arabs were laying siege to Constantinople, he attacked Ravenna. Wait, an Arab siege of Constantinople? Yes, Caliph Suleiman had resolved to conquer mighty Constantinople and refused to abandon the siege even as it stretched over a year. Yes, this is the same Caliph Suleiman who had arranged the disappearance of Musa and Tariq when they arrived in Damascus with a lot of treasure. Anyway, the siege of Constantinople had lasted so long that the Arabs were still stuck outside of the city when Suleiman died in 717. Facing reality, Umar, his successor as caliph, ordered an end to the siege. Actually, the commander of the army at Constantinople was obsessed with victory and attempted to conceal the letter from his starving troops. But word soon spread, and the army started to head home on their own in the summer of 718. Actually, the commander of the army at Constantinople was obsessed with victory and attempted to conceal the letter from his starving troops. But word soon spread, and the army started to head home on their own in the summer of 718. Once Constantinople had driven off the besiegers, Liutprand restored the conquered territory to Ravenna, possibly muttering something about how it had just been a misunderstanding. Hopefully there were no hard feelings. While Charles was sending armed men into Frisia to encourage religious conversion in order to weaken Frisian culture, leaving it open to Frankish assimilation, Odo was dealing with a Muslim invasion from the south. As I already mentioned, Musa and Tariq had conquered Hispania but soon left to make a report to the Caliph. Musa had left his son in charge of the newly conquered lands in Hispania when he began the long journey to Damascus, but his son was soon executed, probably on the orders of Suleiman, who did not want rivals. A new governor was appointed, but the peninsula was basically left alone as long as no member of the local Muslim elite attempted to carve out an independent realm from the Caliph. Instead, the local elite focused on conquering the remaining independent areas in Hispania or raiding southern Frankia. This northern expansion became formal when Governor al-Sam conquered Narbonne and Carcassonne in 719. While both cities were looted to pay for the expedition, al-Sam granted the residents full religious freedom and left a garrison in Narbonne. 2 years later, he returned with an even larger army and siege machinery as he prepared to conquer Toulouse. Duke Odo knew that he needed aid, but it would be extremely awkward to ask Charles for help since they had been on opposing sides of a battlefield just a few years earlier. Actually, the problem was not awkwardness, but the price of the aid. He would have to surrender his independence. Instead, he gathered a sizable army and attacked the Muslims as they laid siege to his capital. Having sat outside Toulouse for nearly 3 months, the Muslims were tired and were taken by surprise. Al-Sam died in the fighting. Odo had fought the Muslims to defend his estates in Aquitaine, but he was equally determined to defend his independence against Charles. Admittedly, Charles had recognized the independence of Aquitaine after Odo handed over Chilperic, but Odo knew that it was simply a matter of time before Charles attempted to extend his control over Aquitaine. Recognizing that he needed an ally, Odo married his daughter to Munuza, governor of a border region who also wanted independence, in his case from Cordoba, the capital of al-Andalus, the Muslims' name for Hispania. It may seem strange that Odo allied with his Muslim neighbors, but he likely had more in common with neighbors, admittedly of a different religion, than a distant overlord who shared a similar religion but was based in the far north and had different cultural values. In theory, the marriage alliance would enable each man to defy their respective overlords. The theory was soon tested, and it failed. Charles had been busy conquering Frisia and expanding east, so he had left Aquitaine alone. However, the marriage gave Charles an excuse to lead his cavalry through Burgundy in the late spring of 731, before advancing into Aquitaine, burning as he went. Odo waited for help for his son-in-law, but Munuza proved unwilling to risk battle, so Odo had to fight on his own. He lost, badly, and had to accept the generous protection of King Theodoric IV, Charles's replacement for Chilperic, who had died a decade earlier. Cordoba was also angry with Munuza, and Odo could not aid him even if he wanted to. That fall, Governor Abd al-Rahman led an army to discipline Munuza, who either committed suicide or was executed by his superior. Abd al-Rahman was now free to advance north and finish the conquest that had been postponed by Odo's victory in 721. Odo resisted, but he had been weakened by his battle with Charles the year before. Bordeaux was sacked, and Poitiers was next. So, Odo had no choice but to ask Charles for help. The combined armies of Charles and Odo defeated the Muslims somewhere near Poitiers. The battle is often described as saving Christian Europe from the Muslims, which is true, although it was unlikely that the governor of al-Andalus could have held the territory for long. Never mind advanced much further, simply because the Pyrenees would make it difficult to supply the Muslim garrisons. In addition, Poitiers is in Aquitaine, which is distant from Austrasia and Neustria, but still, it was a major victory. Good question. Could the Caliph have found Paris on a map? Rome? Certainly. Carthage? Undoubtedly. But a city in former Gaul? Maybe? One key point is that al-Sam had attempted to conquer Toulouse and presumably intended to make it part of the Islamic lands, connecting it to the Muslim foothold in Septimania, since Toulouse is not far from Carcassonne and Narbonne. Poitiers was far, far north, and there are no records that Abd al-Rahman had made a serious effort to leave garrisons and capture towns like Bordeaux as he marched north. Rather than a decisive clash between civilizations, the Battle of Poitiers is basically the answer to a trivia question. What is the furthest north that the Muslims of al-Andalus raided? Without a doubt, Poitiers was an important victory, but it is a major exaggeration to claim that it ended the threat from al-Andalus. In fact, Abd al-Rahman's successor as governor made another attempt against Aquitaine 2 years later and was thrashed by Odo. Later chroniclers would call Charles the Hammer in recognition of the victory. Actually, he was called Charles Martel, which is how he is known today. Anyway, hammer would be a more accurate description of the destruction of Aquitaine that had left Odo vulnerable to a large-scale raid by the governor of a distant province of a caliphate. It is worth stressing that Aquitaine had been stuck between two expansionist kingdoms. Muslims based on the Iberian Peninsula had failed to break through Aquitaine to reach Frankia, until Martel saw an opportunity in a weakened neighbor and attempted to force Odo to bend the knee. Despite many burned farms, Odo refused, until he was faced with another invasion from the south. Anyway, while Charles was undoubtedly happy that they had won instead of lost, he was probably more pleased that Odo had been forced to ask for help, thus acknowledging Charles as his overlord. In fact, Odo also lost his place in history since his victory at Toulouse 11 years earlier was glossed over by scribes loyal to Charles. When Odo died 3 years after the battle, he was succeeded by his son Hunald. However, Charles soon arrived in Aquitaine with an army. Once Charles had expressed his condolences and made the required small talk, he brought up the subject of fealty. The Frankish army does not seem to have been opposed, so the nobles of Aquitaine were probably tired of fighting. Charles simply required that Hunald bend the knee and pay taxes. Otherwise, Hunald was left alone. A year later, Hunald revolted but was defeated. Still, Charles clearly did not feel that he had enough support in Aquitaine to simply execute Hunald and place a puppet in charge, so Hunald remained alive and remained duke. This relatively tolerant approach was completely different than Charles's attitude towards Frisia, which was much closer. Forced conversion imposed by foreign occupiers unsurprisingly provoked a Frisian revolt in 734, led by Radbod's successor, Duke Boubo. Launching attacks from both land and sea, Charles killed Boubo, destroyed temples, and sacked the region to pay for the invasion. Frankish soldiers were then left in Frisia to protect the Christian missionaries, who returned to the conversion process. Once again, the defeat at Poitiers failed to end the threat of attacks from al-Andalus, and a much larger operation was launched in 737. This time, the new governor organized a two-pronged attack where Yusuf, the governor of Narbonne, captured Carcassonne and Nîmes while he invaded Aquitaine. Yusuf had done well because he had found an ally in the region, Morontus, Duke of Provence. While this alliance between Muslims and Christians may seem strange, the submission of Aquitaine was a warning to Provence that Charles was determined to expand his territory. Like Odo of Aquitaine, Morontus clearly felt more comfortable with his Muslim neighbors than a distant Frankish king. Meanwhile, the governor of al-Andalus was rampaging through Burgundy. Charles had been busy in Frisia, but he gathered a large army by late summer and had driven the Muslims back across the Pyrenees. Hoping to end the threat from Septimania, the Franks started a siege of Narbonne, but the city held out until Charles finally abandoned the siege. In 739, another army marched north from al-Andalus, but Charles had arranged for an ally of his own. Liutprand crossed the Alps with his men, and while the exact details of the campaign are unknown, several results occurred. Narbonne remained under Muslim control. Morontus was no longer Duke of Provence, and Liutprand undoubtedly received some financial reward. Honestly, the degree of alliance between Liutprand and Charles is debatable. Liutprand may have simply seen an opportunity to expand his territory in the region. To sum up, Frankia broke apart soon after Pippin's death. The Neustrians revolted, supported by an invasion from Frisia. Fortunately, Pippin's illegitimate son Charles drove the Frisians out of Austrasia. The Neustrians then allied with Odo, Duke of Aquitaine, but were defeated. Having reunited Frankia, Charles chose to expand into Frisia, so Aquitaine remained independent. However, Odo soon found himself facing another expansionist neighbor, al-Andalus, Muslim-controlled Hispania. Although Odo won a major victory over the Muslim invaders, Charles saw an opportunity and burned his way through Aquitaine until Odo submitted. When the new governor of al-Andalus attacked Aquitaine, Odo was too weak to defeat the invaders, so he had to ask Charles for help, thus acknowledging the Frankish king as his overlord. Together, they defeated the Muslims at Poitiers. So Charles had gained full control of Frankia. But would the kingdom remain united when he died? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.